Welcome everybody to Citing Vulnerabilities Season 4. The first talk today by Casey Williams, arguably one of the world's most significant energy humanities scholar and also a public intellectual. So unlike most of us, he also does a lot of public writing, which makes it all the more accessible and significant. For those of you who are joining here for the first time, Citing Vulnerability is a series of talks hosted by the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies at the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad. My faculty fellow here, Professor Anna Kurian, will introduce the speaker, but I'll first introduce her, Shakespeare scholar and early modern specialist. We also have a project assistant, Atul Nair, who works on English periodicals and in India from the late 18th to the mid 19th century. The UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies examines various forms of vulnerability. It's a teaching and research unit as mandated by the UNESCO's agreement with us. So we have had, as Anna pointed out last time, a predominance of climate change talks. Season 4 marks a slight shift, although we are beginning with climate crisis and fossil capitalism with Casey Williams' talk. So we will be having hate studies specialist Barbara Perry speaking. She holds the UNESCO chair in hate studies. We also have Richard Ovenden, librarian Bodleian, the University of Oxford, speaking on burning books. Welcome to all of you. We would also like to remind you that all the talks are recorded and they go up as OERs on the UNESCO Chair's website after the series comes to a conclusion. So you can expect this sometime in April, May, that we will be having the recordings all up. So I would like to thank Casey Williams for agreeing to come to this. I've admired his work for some time now, so it's great to see him in person here, within quotes, of course. And now over to Anna for a more formal introduction to Casey. Thank you.
Casey Williams is lecturer in the Center for Environmental Studies at Rice University in Houston, Texas. He holds a PhD in literature from Duke University, and his specialization is in cultural studies. He's currently writing a book about the aesthetics of climate crisis and the depoliticization of climate change in contemporary US culture. He's also working on projects related to renewable energy imaginaries, the political economy of just energy transitions, as well as the cultural impacts of renewable energy transitions across the globe. He's published work in Nature, Climate Change, Climate and Development, Radical Philosophy, Bare Life Review, and Polygraph. And the public intellectual role is through work published in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Dissent, In These Times, and elsewhere. We are very happy to have with us Professor Casey Williams.
Well, thank you much, Professor Kurian, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Professor Nair, for inviting me here today. Thank you as well to the Department of English at the University of Hyderabad and the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies. So I'm just going to share my screen so I can show you my slides. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the aesthetics and politics of what I'm thinking of as climate forensics. And I promise that this talk will be about energy, even though it might not seem like it's about energy at first, because what we're really interested in here is how to represent something as dispersed and abstract as fossil capitalism. So a form of political economy that depends on fossil fuels as a condition for accumulation, as well as something that underpins the infrastructures of social reproduction increasingly globally. So I'll use climate forensics to get at this question of representing fossil capitalism. And I'm thinking of forensics both in terms of empirical investigation and in terms of rhetoric. So by climate forensics, I mean the techniques that are used to determine whether or not global warming played a role in causing specific weather events like wildfires. as well as the rhetorical techniques used to communicate that judgment. The concept of climate forensics dates back at least to the 1990s, but it has grown in importance as the effects of climate change have grown more immediately catastrophic. And in the US, as I'm sure you know, wildfires recently devastated parts of Los Angeles, and the blame game began immediately. Elon Musk blamed the fires on DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, while voices on the liberal left countered that climate change was to blame for the fires, whose apocalyptic intensity was cast as yet another reason to urgently decarbonize. Shortly after the fires erupted, researchers with an institute called World Weather Attribution, based in London, judged that climate change had indeed increased the likelihood of such fires, leading journalists to report, as one headline read, quote, "Climate change's undeniable fingerprints all over deadly wildfires." This sort of forensic imagery, the language of fingerprints, as well as of culprits and smoking guns, suffuses accounts of contemporary disasters. And that writers turn to such imagery is not surprising. There's been a growing interest in holding major greenhouse gas emitters like fossil fuel corporations morally, legally, and politically responsible for the increasingly catastrophic consequences of fossil fuel use. And new methods of extreme weather attribution, which link specific weather events to climate change, have made it easier to make the case for reparative justice in law courts, as well as in courts of public opinion. In this sense, both the science and the rhetoric of climate forensics have become central to struggles for climate justice, whether justice means national level reparations or the restitution of personal property. As climatologist Miles Allen wrote in a 2004 Nature article describing these new methods of weather attribution, quote, "The issue is important as it touches on a question that is far closer to many of our hearts than global sustainability or planetary survival: who to sue when the house price falls." Climate change, as climatologists like Allen often point out, is not in itself perceptible. It is a statistical average of weather changes over time, mediated by sprawling data infrastructures and complex mathematical models. Given this, and given too that the fossil fuel industry and its state allies have long sown doubt about climate change to delay action, any method that can link climate change to specific events represents a potentially powerful tool for climate justice. It promises to overcome the limits of our blinkered imaginations, as well as the cynical skepticism of the fossil fuel industry, by providing material evidence that climate change is not only real, but also that it is a catastrophic and present threat, rather than one looming beyond the horizon. Such evidence, it is hoped, can, quote, "rouse public sentiment and warrant political intervention," as Rob Nixon put it, as well as win court cases that force companies to stop burning fossil fuels, or which require them to compensate people harmed by that combustion. There is, however, considerable controversy over the methods and uses of climate forensics, as I will try to explain. And as I do so, I want to make three basic points. And the first point I want to make is simply that the forensic techniques used to investigate potential climate disasters have an aesthetic and a political dimension, in addition to having an empirical one. How these techniques are deployed has consequences for how we define climate change and for what we imagine just responses to be. The second point I want to make is that what scholar Wendy Chun describes as the forensic imaginary shapes how climate change has been constructed as an object of political concern. So Chun defines the forensic imaginary as a way of thinking about evidence that assigns evidence the force of law, or which imagines that the existence of evidence should be sufficient to produce justice on its own. And the last point I want to make is that the power assigned to evidence within this forensic imaginary may be symptomatic of fossil capitalism's tendency to undermine the conditions for substantive democracy. And by this, I mean conditions in which people collectively conceive and execute their own plans for the future. And I've organized what follows in the following way. So I will first discuss controversies surrounding the causes of the Syrian civil war. I'll then break down extreme event attribution, which is a method of climate forensics. And I'll explain what some of the criticisms of this method are. And then I'll discuss the idea of the forensic imaginary in relation to fossil capitalism and the crisis of democracy. So to begin, I want to turn to a question that sparked over a decade of controversy among climate change researchers. Did climate change significantly contribute to the 2011 Syrian civil war? The controversy began in 2015. A team of scientists published an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences with an unassuming title, Climate Change in the Fertile Crescent and Implications of the Recent Syrian Drought. In this article, the authors make several striking claims. They observe that the 2011 Syrian civil war was preceded by the most severe drought in the instrumental record, whose unprecedented severity was partly due to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, which had increased average temperatures and contributed to a long-term drying trend in the Eastern Mediterranean. Global warming, the authors wrote, has increased the probability of severe and persistent droughts in the Fertile Crescent and made the occurrence of a 3-year drought as severe as that of 2007 to 2010, 2 to 3 times more likely than by natural variability alone. This drought contributed to the outbreak of war, they wrote, by causing widespread crop failure and a mass migration of farming families to urban centers, especially Damascus, where civil unrest was met with violent state repression, eventually escalating into bitter war. This narrative was quickly taken up in the European and North American press. At precisely this moment, in early 2015, hundreds of thousands of people, many of them displaced by the Syrian civil war, were streaming into Europe. The idea that these migrants might be climate refugees, as Scientific American put it, became a powerful narrative framework for explaining the so-called migrant crisis in Europe and the nativist backlash that followed it. Speaking a few years later, former US Vice President Al Gore famously suggested that climate change may even have been responsible for Brexit. Quote, before the gates of hell in Syria, what happened was a climate-related extreme drought. 2015, of course, was also the year of the much anticipated Paris Climate Summit. As world leaders prepared to gather in Paris, the Syrian climate conflict thesis seemed to draw a straight line from climate change to the most pressing issues of the moment: war, migration, rising nativism, raising the stakes of the summit and providing a grim portent of the upheavals to come if the meeting were to end in failure. There were, however, researchers who worried that the Syrian climate conflict thesis obscured more than it clarified. Some argued that blaming climate change for the war and subsequent emigrations risked securitizing the climate issue by reducing climate change to its embodiment in the figure of the climate migrant, a move that could make immigration restrictions or even military interventions appear like a form of pragmatic climate policy. For others, the Syria climate conflict thesis simply claimed more than the evidence warranted. It seemed to overstate climate change's causal contribution to the war, and in doing so, reduced a complex social crisis to just one of its many contributing factors. Over the next few years, articles and books emerged scrutinizing each link of the causal chain connecting climate change to the Syrian civil war. The most comprehensive of these studies, published by Jan Selby, Gabriel Daoust, and Clemens Hoffman, suggested that, quote, there is no clear and reliable evidence that human influences on the climate system are implicated in the drought preceding the war, nor that drought-related migration was a contributory factor in civil war onset. The authors point to other, what they think are more relevant factors, and these include President Bashar al-Assad's program of market liberalization in the early 2000s, which caused prices for diesel fuel and other goods to spike by over 300%, as well as the regime's violent response to the Arab Spring protests, factors which themselves cannot be fully understood outside the broader context of French and British colonialism in the Levant, Syria's idiosyncratic course of post-colonial development, as well as US military adventurism in the region. Importantly, critics of the climate conflict thesis do not dispute the reality of climate change, nor do they rule out the possibility that global warming may have played a role in creating the conditions that led to the Syrian civil war. Instead, they challenge the reliability of the evidence presented, as well as the coherence of the narrative erected on this evidentiary foundation. For such critics, narrativizing disasters in relation to global warming is possible, but it must be done carefully, as it always risks imposing on disaster a univocal story about climate change that pushes other causal factors out of the frame. These factors include social vulnerabilities like persistent inequality, which are themselves products of political economic conditions whose effects can be so pervasive as to be impossible to capture in a linear narrative. The critique of the climate conflict thesis is thus ultimately an argument about the politics of aesthetics, or what is made visible and invisible by the way we frame a given problem. Critics like Selby argue that it is a short step from framing a disaster in relation to climate change to simply blaming nature for a disaster, and in doing so, providing political cover for disaster's architects and beneficiaries. Selby has suggested, for instance, that the Syrian climate conflict thesis originated from within Assad's own government as a way to deflect blame. Selby writes that the Assad regime would regularly take diplomats to the Northeast and tell them it all has to do with global warming, blaming what was in essence a state-induced socio-ecological crisis on climatic transformations beyond its control. Identifying climate change as a causal factor in a drought does not necessitate this sort of blame shifting, but the risk is widely recognized. Friederike Otto, lead researcher at World Weather Attribution, has written that when the press reports on attribution research, often, quote, the only message that is received is that of the importance of climate change. And with two co-authors, Otto published a commentary in Nature, Stop Blaming the Climate for Disasters. And so this is significant that the most influential figure in the world of climate attribution would make such a statement, felt the need to make such a statement publicly. It indicates how seriously researchers across disciplines take the risk of what geographer Mike Holm has called climate reductionism. So what the Syria case clarifies is that attributing events to climate change is not only an empirical procedure, but it's also an aesthetic and a narrative procedure with contested political consequences. And this insistence that I'm making here, that the empirical is also aesthetic and political, is really at the heart of critical theories of forensics. So a word about forensics. Put schematically, forensic investigations involve analyzing traces left on matter by matter and inferring from these traces a plausible narrative of some event in the past, usually with an eye toward responsibility. I.L. Weitzman notes that forensic investigations begin from Locard's principle that every contact leaves a trace, a fingerprint, a bruise, debris, so on. Forensic investigators approach matter as a repository of such traces, which is to say, they approach matter as media, and they read this media for signs that can be decoded by human or machine intelligences. Weitzman describes this process as prosopopoeia, the rhetorical practice of symbolically animating matter, of affording it the capacity to speak in such a way that it can be heard by us. Insofar as climate forensics is a form of prosopopoeia, it is an attempt to make climate change speak to us through its effects. And as Weitzman and Thomas Keenan also note, forensics, from the Greek forensis, ultimately pertains to the forum, to the spaces of debate, deliberation, and decision that organize political life. Climate forensics then always has this rhetorical dimension. The evidence it generates is always offered in a particular forum with particular rules and conventions in support of a particular judgment. The judgment is almost always the urgent need for decarbonization. Reflecting on the Syrian climate conflict thesis, Selby, Daoust, and Hoffman write that ever since the mid-2000s, the securitization of climate change has been led by an interest in dramatizing the seriousness of climate change and the need for deeper emissions reductions. And the discourse that they're alluding to here is likely quite familiar to scholars in the humanities. For many years, across many disciplines, scholars have suggested that the data and models used to construct climate change as an object of knowledge are not dramatic, not emotionally resonant, not even visible as such. They defy the genre conventions of juridically legible violence and lack the rhetorical force to rouse public sentiments and warrant political intervention, to return to Nixon's phrase. And so one hope articulated for climate forensics is that it can generate warrants for political intervention by downscaling climate change to its local manifestations. As Shannon Osaka and Rob Bellamy write, quote, "Part of this movement from global to local has been spurred by a sense that climate inaction stems from the invisible nature of global climate change, a phenomenon distant in both space and time." And they continue, "Many scholars believe that connecting global climate change to regional and local impacts could make climate more personal and relevant to everyday human lives." So presented in the public forum, climate forensics often represents a way to persuade everyday people of the urgent need for climate action. And again, this is a discourse that's very familiar in the environmental humanities. But over the last 20 years, researchers have sought to develop forensic methods that can also generate evidence for use in legal fora, so that don't just have a place in the public forum, but also in courts of law. One of these methods, called extreme event attribution, has earned particular attention for its potential to fill the evidentiary gap in climate litigation. And this idea of an evidentiary gap looms large in the climate law literature. Climate advocacy groups have filed many lawsuits over the last 2 decades, seeking to hold greenhouse gas emissions legally liable for the consequences of their emissions. Courts around the world have largely dismissed these suits, often because they failed to prove that a plaintiff's injuries are traceable to a defendant's actions. As Rupert Stewart Smith and his colleagues observe, in the Western legal system, quote, claims for compensatory damages must demonstrate a causal link between the defendant's behavior and the plaintiff's injury. In principle, extreme weather attribution makes it possible to demonstrate such a causal link, as researchers can use climate models to run what are essentially controlled experiments on the climate system. And I'll explain this in more detail in a moment. Viewed as an aesthetic and political technology, these models allow researchers to translate the material effects of global warming into concepts and narratives that conform to the genre conventions of Western civil and criminal law. Specifically, they make it possible to generate but-for statements, as in, but for anthropogenic emissions, the Syrian drought would have been 2 to 3 times less severe. In 2014, legal theorist Adrian Lahoud cited the absence of such concepts and narratives as a barrier to climate litigation. And he anticipated that climate models would become key material witnesses in the adjudication of climate justice claims. He wrote, "What happens when a crime is no longer visible to unmediated human perception? In the case of climate change, will the era of the scientific model come to replace human testimony in adjudicating humanitarian claims?" These new questions in law emerge in recognition of the challenges that climate change brings, the most important of which will be the nexus formed between climatology and criminology. And so extreme event attribution sits precisely at the nexus of climatology and criminology. And the method works like this. Once researchers have selected an event to investigate, which is always a physical hazard, like a heat wave or a hurricane, they use meteorological data to construct models of 2 scenarios. One scenario models climate patterns as if greenhouse gas concentrations had not increased since the Industrial Revolution. This is the counterfactual scenario. Another models climate patterns as if those concentrations had increased at the same rate as they did in the real world. This is the factual scenario. By comparing the differences between the factual and counterfactual scenarios, researchers can run experiments that allow them to assess the degree to which an event was made more likely or severe because of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Doing so allows researchers to make causal inferences. For instance, for the period between 2007 and 2010, researchers determined that drought in the Fertile Crescent was significantly more likely in our world than in one where the steam engine remained a sketch in Watt's notebook. And this is what this slide is showing. The counterfactual model observations for the Syrian drought. This counterfactual modeling method distinguishes extreme event attribution from other forensic techniques. Although differences between climate patterns act much like a fingerprint, as Lahoud puts it, extreme event attribution is unlike fingerprinting in key ways. Fingerprints are physical impressions left by fingertips on matter. Interpreting fingerprints involves transferring those impressions to media, to dust, tape, paper, etc., which can be decoded by humans as material traces of some event in the past, caused by a subject that is presumed to have agency. Anthropogenic emissions are not like human fingers. They interact with the climate system in complex ways, and while they do leave impressions on matter like ice cores, the impressions they leave on weather are indirect and not easily recorded in media. Climate change's fingerprints must, in a sense, be constructed by comparing the model simulations. This comparison also constructs anthropogenic emissions as a single variable and thus as a causal agent, as something that could have fingerprints. In the same way that fingerprinting posits a coherent subject who is imagined to bear responsibility for his actions, however molded he may be by his context, this counterfactual forensic method cannot help but posit anthropogenic emissions as a unified force that acts on the world. And in the process, anthropogenic emissions are abstracted from the social relations in which emitters emit, which is to say, they are abstracted from capitalist social relations, which compel fossil fuel combustion as a condition of accumulation. This process also abstracts emissions from the many other forces that contribute to climate disasters. For critics of extreme event attribution, this process of abstraction, of isolating anthropogenic emissions as a climatological force, is the origin point for discourses like the Syria climate conflict thesis that reduce complex disasters to their climate dimension. For Osaka and Bellamy, the fundamental issue is that isolating anthropogenic forces presumes that human and non-human influences on socio-ecological systems can be neatly distinguished. They write, in seeking to uncover the fingerprint of anthropogenic climate change in extreme weather, researchers are delineating some weather events as natural and others as anthropogenic. This new modeling methodology creates a new nature-culture divide, both scientifically and discursively. Scientifically, by establishing a method by which events are decomposed into their constituent forcings, and discursively, by recreating this divide in media coverage and public discourse. They describe the product of this division as a partitioned causality. And for Osaka and Bellamy, partitioning natural and social causes obscures forms of agency that cannot be easily represented as anthropogenic forces, including systemic forces like colonialism and capitalism that sustain inequality. So already we see that in some ways the problem of representing climate change as a causal force in disaster is the same problem that we run into when we try to represent something like capitalism or colonialism, a structural force. To put this argument in the language of political ecology, we might say that extreme event attribution isolates human contributions to meteorological hazards, but cannot account for human contributions to social vulnerabilities. As Holm writes, by emphasizing meteorology, this move implicitly ignores local or historical human agency in conditioning the economic, social, technological, or political components of disaster. And the risk, of course, is a familiar one. The risk is that if we do this, the architects of social vulnerability can return to their most reliable alibi, which is the idea that this disaster was not caused by us, but by nature, force majeure, the hand of God. It's important to emphasize that researchers who use extreme event attribution are very aware of these criticisms. They share many of them, and they frequently publish assessments of social vulnerability alongside their attribution studies. Moreover, as litigators begin to use extreme event attribution to fill the evidentiary gap in lawsuits, they have attempted to move beyond the partitioned causality that Osaka and Bellamy describe. And they have done so by assigning what I think of as fractional culpability to emitters for their contributions to climate-related disasters. And the highest profile example of this is a case that's currently before the German courts called Liuya versus RWE. The plaintiff in the case is a Peruvian farmer named Luciano Liuya, who alleges that Germany's electric utility, RWE, is responsible for 0.47% of the damages associated with melting glaciers near Liuya's home in Huaraz, Peru. This number, 0.47%, corresponds to RWE's fractional contribution to total greenhouse gas emissions since 1750. This case is still pending, but it captures, in my view, the strengths and limitations of using climate forensics to assign fractional culpability. On the one hand, this move represents an important step towards reparative climate justice. Victims of climate disasters can now sue individual emitters for damages. At the same time, the idea of fractional culpability ultimately rests on an additive or even reified image of responsibility. And by this, I mean that it defines climate change as the sum total of individual emissions rather than as a symptom of capitalist social relations, which not only compel fossil fuel combustion, but which also distribute vulnerability in predictively uneven ways. And we can debate about whether or not capitalism seems like the right name for this. But if we accept the general claim that culpability for climate change ultimately resides in structures rather than with agents, then climate justice means dismantling or fundamentally reconfiguring those structures, what the philosopher Olufemi Taiwo calls literally remaking the world. So, some scholars have celebrated advancements in climate forensics precisely because more ambitious reforms, to say nothing of remaking the world, seem to be off the table. As Friederike Otto and Frederick Fabian write, quote, "Without national and international non-judicial mechanisms, such as a functioning fund for loss and damage, and in the absence of support from other institutions, climate litigation against emitting companies and countries is often the only way to achieve climate justice." And as Sophie Marjanac and Lindeen Patton write, the next set of litigation issues will likely turn on evidence gathered by extreme event attribution. One detects a certain sub-utopian hopefulness in these accounts. What these scholars are arguing is that even if our deliberative institutions fail us, we can win some modicum of justice by generating the right kind of scientific evidence and submitting it to the right kind of juridical form. This argument resonates with what media theorist Wendy Chun describes as the forensic imaginary, which is a narrow way of thinking about forensics in which one expects evidence to produce just outcomes without the need for deliberation or judgment. As an example of the forensic imaginary, Chun cites something legal scholars call the CSI effect. And if you don't know, CSI is an extremely popular TV crime drama in the US. And research suggests that due to the popularity of this show, US juries increasingly convict criminal defendants only on the basis of forensic evidence, especially DNA. And this overestimation of the adjudicative force of forensics, the belief that evidence itself carries the force of law, is built into CSI's narrative structure. Stalled investigations get moving again when DNA turns up. A fingerprint match wins a guilty verdict and ends an episode. And within this narrative logic, forensic evidence obviates the need for reasoning, for deliberation, even the making of a decision. What the forensic imaginary imagines then is an anti-democratic or even anti-political relationship between evidence and judgment, where evidence becomes a substitute for judgment rather than its starting point. And I want to suggest that this way of thinking about forensics steps into the space vacated by democracy. And I mean democracy in a strong sense, as conditions which allow people to collectively plan and execute their own visions of the future. In the US, where I'm sitting, the conditions for collective future making have been eroding for decades, since well before the Trump phenomenon. According to the political theorist Anton Jaeger, de-democratization in North America reflects a broader tendency towards social atomization that afflicts modern fossil capitalist societies, and which erodes institutions like labor unions that have historically allowed ordinary people to intervene in politics as a bloc. The reasons for such atomization are complex, but Jaeger makes the case that basic tendencies of fossil capitalist development, from primitive accumulation to fossil-fueled mechanization and globalization, as well as concerted attacks via the neoliberal state on organized labor, these have all been instrumental in fragmenting social life. As Jaeger puts it, individualization was an imperative for capital, and collective life had to be diminished in order for the market to find new avenues for accumulation. Lukács, the Marxian cultural critic Lukács, emphasizes that such atomization estranges workers from their own sense of historical agency, while at the same time ascribing agency to objects, to commodities, and to the ostensibly objective workings of the markets and the bourgeois state. This is how Lukács understands the Marxian concept of reification. Writing about reification in History and Class Consciousness, Lukács argues that mechanization makes of workers isolated abstract atoms whose work no longer brings them together directly and organically, as well as that the specialization of skills leads to the destruction of every image of the whole. The fate of the worker, Lukács adds, becomes the fate of society as a whole. Elsewhere in History and Class Consciousness, Lukács emphasizes the profoundly depoliticizing consequences of reification by turning to Max Weber. The telos of capitalist modernization, Weber suggests, is to reduce judgment to a mechanical operation. In the bureaucratic state with its rational laws, the judge is more or less an automatic statute dispensing machine in which you insert the files together with the necessary costs and dues at the top, whereupon he will eject the judgment together with the more or less cogent reasons for it at the bottom. That is to say, where the judge's behavior is on the whole predictable. This fantasy of predictable, automatic justice, where the correct protocol transmutes evidence into judgments without the need for agonistic debate, sounds to me very much like Chun's account of the depoliticized forensic imaginary. And it seems to capture at least one of the ways climate forensics is imagined to operate. As Chun observes, the substitution of evidence for judgment has long been a feature of climate change discourse. Global climate change has been framed as a no-brainer, she writes, a decision that should entail no decision. Eliminating the need for a decision is one of the goals explicitly articulated for extreme weather attribution, whose promise to provide the essential causal link demanded by the conventions of the Western legal system represents the possibility of achieving climate goals without having to hope that states will meet their decarbonization targets or voluntarily provide loss and damage compensation. As Otto and Fabian observe, using climate forensics to support litigation is currently seen as one of the only avenues for climate justice, precisely because powerful oil-producing states like the US have fought tooth and nail to ensure that the UNFCCC never commits to fossil fuel phase out, much less mandates compensation for climate-related losses and damages. So put differently and in conclusion, we might say that enthusiasm for extreme event attribution becomes symptomatic of the failure of deliberative institutions to respond to popular demands for decarbonization and reparative justice, especially demands from the global South where people are experiencing the worst consequences of climate change. These institutions, like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, have of course always been captured by private capital, former colonial powers, and the US, which is the neo-colonial hegemon. Yet as these institutions break down, and as the fantasy of global deliberative governance becomes harder to sustain, one sees a kind of nostalgia for the fiction of a truly rational, predictable system of global governance. And in the absence even of such a fiction, the mechanical predictability of the law becomes a site where one can invest hope for the possibility of climate justice. And if one conceives of the law on the model described by Weber as a depoliticized, mechanized procedure for converting evidence into judgment, then climate forensics acquires a singular importance. Faith in forensics is, however, I think, a recipe for fatalism or mechanistic determinism, a belief that the objective movement of history, as Frederick Jameson put it, inches forward automatically without the labor of those who make and remake the world on a daily basis. The forensic imaginary, as Chun describes it, seems at home with such fatalism. If climate change appears to you as a crisis, but you do not believe that you possess the historical agency required to respond to it, then perhaps it makes sense to put your faith in forensics, to believe that the right kinds of evidence submitted in the right forum will lead, as if automatically, to justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Williams. That was a fascinating talk. Would you be taking questions and comments from the audience?
Sure, yes, very happy to take questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you. Roy has a question. Roy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Williams. That was indeed enlightening. When we were discussing reconfiguring structures, I was thinking of developed economies, because developed economies are ironically least rich in natural resources and most dependent on resources too. So the more an economy develops, the more resources it needs. So when fuels are burned, let's say, to create more factories, to create more industries, that the fact that using up itself creates a scene where more fuel has to be used up in the future, where the economy itself becomes bigger. If we think of it as a machine, the machine gets larger and it needs even more fuel to burn. So in a sense, the demand for fuel of developed economies itself it's an evidence of the crimes that they have committed, because the very fact that they need this much fuel to run the large machines that they have created itself shows that they are culpable. And there again, like when we look at, let's say, the current fuel crisis that Germany is facing, because Russia has refused to provide natural gas, and which again it's fossil fuel, and so Germany it tries to now it tries to change from fossil fuel to other sources, but thanks to its very slow bureaucracy and its lack of let's say environment friendly planning, it is unable to it's unable to find alternatives within, let's say, 5 to 10 years. So it has to think of a combination of alternatives to the one a natural gas supply that used to be provided by Russia. So when we think of it in this context, isn't it also true that the no matter how overwhelming the evidence against, let's say, developed economies is, it fails to prevent them from going in the same path that they have been going, as in this case, keeping on burning fossil fuels. And even though one should ideally stop burning fossil fuels before the global fossil fuel supply goes out, doesn't that prospect seem moot? Because at the rate they are going, the only thing that could stop them is the global fossil fuel supply running out, and that too, not in the so distant future. That was my question.
Right. Well, thank you for that question. No, I think that's precisely the problem, which is that the evidence generated so far and presented in the fora that we have available for making claims about the necessity of decarbonization or claims for compensation for loss and damage, these fora have not been working because they're captured in large part by fossil fuel interests via the interests of the US or other oil producing states, including Canada, Saudi Arabia. So there's a breakdown in the link between evidence and judgment or action. And so part of what I'm suggesting is that as this link breaks down, there's a kind of, I call it a sub-utopian hopefulness that other fora, specifically the law outside of the UN, but in regional courts or even in international courts, that the law, which appears to operate in a kind of mechanistic fashion, can deliver justice that the UN cannot. But I think that this is ultimately a kind of troubling concession to a sense of powerlessness that we don't actually have to accept. I mean, the other thing that would prevent major emitters from continuing to use fossil fuels, apart from global supplies running out, would be some kind of coordinated political action, regionally or in the major polluting states, that would impose some kind of social cost on the emitters that would force them to give up their fossil fuels. But I just want to highlight one other thing you said. I thought it was interesting. You said the necessity for fossil fuel growth in the developed world is itself a kind of evidence of criminality. That's a very interesting way and different way of thinking about the kinds of evidence one could submit. And the question would be, what do you do with that evidence?
Thank you, Professor Williams.
Madhavi Ravikumar has a question. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Williams, for that excellent presentation. Actually, I have a small question. How do you perceive the tension between the increasing reliance on climate forensics for accountability and the persistent political inertia in addressing fossil capitalism's structural roots? I mean to say, in other words, do you think Forsynic imaginary, while powerful in attributing responsibility, might inadvertently shift focus away from the systemic ongoing nature of fossil fuel dependence?
I think absolutely. I think that's precisely one of the risks. And the turn to climate forensics and the hope that forensic evidence submitted in legal fora specifically can produce climate justice where other forums have failed to do so, is symptomatic of the difficulty of wrestling with the structural issues that you describe. So the structural nature of fossil fuel dependence, which has to do with the political economy of capitalism in its current globalized form, because it has been so difficult to deal with that, because dealing with it actually entails massive transformations in the way we organize contemporary economic and social life. The difficulty of confronting that is one of the reasons, I think, why forensics is so appealing, especially to people who think just some modicum of justice is necessary in the short term. But I completely agree in that I think the structural problem is the one that ultimately needs to be addressed, and the forensic methods that are currently available don't address it. Now, one could make the sort of dialectical argument that the failure of climate forensics to address the structural issue points to the necessity of addressing the structural issue, right? It illuminates even as it fails to do the thing it says it wants to do. But there are also lots of other reasons, lots of other evidence that we have a kind of structural dependence that needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Professor.
Professor Williams, I have a question, if you wouldn't mind. You mentioned, from what I understood, you mentioned that climate forensics obviously has an evidentiary purpose, and therefore there is also a very crucial rhetorical element to climate forensics. I mean, and therefore, does it run the risk of the many uses that rhetoric can be put to, in the sense that on the one hand, we are looking at evidence to argue the case for climate justice, for the fact that climate change is fueling all sorts of not just environmental problems, but also political problems across the world. But on the other hand, you have influential political leaders who don't just refuse climate change, they flatly deny it. So, and during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, India had several state elections. Some of India's largest states went to polls at the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, so you have the entire government machinery, in one sense, completely ignoring, neglecting the facts that stare us in the face. And India's capital, New Delhi, for example, it just had an election, and across the board, across political parties, almost nobody, and Delhi remains one of the most polluted cities on earth. And pollution and climate justice were not things that were discussed in political rallies, in speeches, and this is across party lines. So my question is, and I'm wondering rather, when we talk of the rhetorical element of climate forensics, how do we guard against the many different uses that rhetoric can be put to? I mean, rhetoric can also very clearly deny and refuse the presence of what we are trying to prove. So yeah, that's just my question.
Yeah, thank you for that. No, I mean, climate denial remains a serious problem. We have a new but old president in the U.S. who, denies the existence of climate change and has reversed or plans to reverse even the relatively small gains that the U.S. made under the Biden administration towards a transition away from fossil fuels. So the problem that you address in relation to climate change and then other issues like the COVID pandemic, we also now have a Secretary of Health who doesn't believe in vaccines. So this kind of denialism remains a persistent problem across a number of states. I am not sure that the kinds of rhetorical possibilities afforded by extreme event attribution, for instance, are sufficient to persuade those kinds of figures to change their minds. So the question becomes not how do you combat denialism on its own terms, but how do you build support for particular interventions among other kinds of people? So how do you use rhetoric? Because there is no state. I'm never going to be on stage with Donald Trump, for instance. I'm never going to have a debate with him where I'm going to be able to attempt to persuade him of something. So how do you use the rhetorical capabilities that you have to try to build support among people, in different kinds of configurations and different kinds of places to support policies or measures that achieve, in this case, decarbonization goals or loss and damage goals. So rhetoric is extremely important. The way that people at our level use rhetoric is different, I think, than the way government officials do.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Are there any more questions, comments for Professor Williams? If there are no more questions, we could move on to a formal vote of thanks. On behalf of the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies here at the Department of English in the University of Hyderabad, may I take this opportunity to thank Professor K.C. Williams for accepting our invitation and for delivering this very timely, very topical lecture. Thank you so much for making time for this lecture series. And thank you to everybody in the audience for turning up. And we do hope that you spread the word and more people join in. Thank you so much everybody. And we hope that you go through the UNESCO Chair website. And as Professor Nair mentioned, these lectures will be up on our YouTube channel. So once again, thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for coming.
And thank you all very much. It was really a pleasure to speak to you all today.
Thank you, Casey. That's a great start. Thank you. Thank you all. Bye.
Wonderful. Thank you.